Hello, and welcome back to Echoes of the Night. If you're new here, I'm glad you've joined us. Make sure to get comfortable, perhaps grab a warm drink or even a snack. After all, it's always nice to settle in before diving into a good story. And don't forget to let me know where you're listening from. I love hearing your thoughts and comments. And of course, if you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss one of these tales. Now, let's get into it. It was a quiet Friday evening when I first noticed something off. The world outside was calm, the kind of evening that made you feel like you could almost hear the hum of the earth itself. It was a perfect night for a pizza. The smell of fresh dough and melting cheese was always a comfort, and I was looking forward to the simple pleasure of dinner. I had just moved into the small house on the corner of Willowbrook Street. It wasn't much, just a one-story with a red door and a cozy little porch that always seemed to beckon me to sit and unwind after a long day. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people waved to one another on their way to work, or chatted over fences about the weather. It was a good place to be alone, but not too alone. A nice balance, you know. I'd spent most of the afternoon getting settled in, arranging furniture, unpacking boxes, and making the place feel like home. By evening, everything was in place, and the house felt warm, inviting. I put on some music, the soft hum of an old vinyl record playing in the background as I relaxed on the couch. It was one of those days where nothing extraordinary happened, just the kind of ordinary that made everything feel right. I reached for my phone and ordered a pizza, my favorite, extra cheese, mushrooms, and pepperoni. The delivery would take about 30 minutes, just enough time for me to settle into the quiet of the evening. The house was dark except for the soft glow of the living room lamp, and I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves outside as a gentle breeze moved through the trees. Everything felt still, peaceful even. But then, as I looked at the clock, I noticed something strange. The delivery time had passed. 30 minutes had come and gone, and there was no sign of the pizza. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe there had been a delay. After all, it wasn't unusual for deliveries to be a little late. I stretched out on the couch, glancing around the room. The house, with its creaky wooden floors and cozy corners, felt safe. Too safe, almost. The sound of a car passing outside broke the silence, and I stood up to check the window. A faint, distant sound of tires on the wet road echoed in the air, but no car had pulled up to my house. Strange. I felt a brief shiver run down my spine, but I brushed it off. Exercise. Kelly nodded encouragingly. I walked over to the door and checked the lock. It was secure, just like it had been when I first arrived. The quiet continued, and I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. It was only then that I noticed something else, something subtle but unsettling. The front door, the red one that I had carefully locked just a few hours earlier, was slightly ajar. At first, I thought I must have imagined it. Maybe I hadn't locked it properly. But as I approached the door, the small gap seemed impossible to ignore. My heart skipped a beat. Had someone been inside, or was it simply the wind? "How much time does it take you to show up?" he asked, his voice heavy with anger and pain. I slowly stepped closer, the familiar hum of the vinyl still playing in the background. But the door was not as I had left it. A draft blew from the crack, cold and sudden, making me shiver as I pushed the door open fully. There was nothing out of place, no signs of forced entry, nothing that screamed danger, yet something about the situation felt wrong. Too wrong. I stepped back into the living room, still scanning the house. The soft hum of the record now seemed distant, the familiar comfort of the evening slipping away. My mind raced through the possibilities, none of which made sense. Maybe I had simply forgotten to lock the door, but that didn't explain the draft, the subtle chill that had crept in from the outside. I shook my head and forced myself to focus. It was just a door. Maybe the wind had pushed it open, maybe the lock wasn't secure. It didn't matter. But then I noticed something else. The faintest sound, a soft scraping noise, came from somewhere deeper in the house. It was barely perceptible, like the sound of something shifting, just out of sight. I stood frozen, my pulse quickening. The house felt too quiet now, too still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced at the door again, now closed. Had it been open for a reason? I felt a knot form in my stomach as I stared at the familiar, peaceful home around me. It no longer felt quite so safe. And as the sound of the scraping continued, growing louder, my mind couldn't help but wonder. What if something, or someone, was here? The scraping sound persisted, faint but steady. It wasn't the wind or the house settling. No, this was something different, deliberate, almost as if it was being caused by something, or someone, trying to stay hidden. I took a slow breath, my heart thudding in my chest as I stood there, motionless. The room seemed to close in around me, the soft glow of the lamp doing little to push back the creeping sense of unease. My eyes darted to the front door, now firmly shut. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The sound came again, louder this time. A scraping, then a soft thud. My instincts screamed at me to move, to check what was happening, but my feet were glued to the floor. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. The house was still. Too still. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I glanced around, trying to make sense of the silence. The music played softly in the background, but it felt out of place now, like it was just a cover for the strange, unnerving sounds I couldn't explain. Beck shook his head. It was coming from the kitchen. I hadn't even realized it, but I had unconsciously been moving toward the sound, my body betraying my mind's desperate desire to stay still. My hand reached for the wall, steadying myself as I took a cautious step toward the hallway that led to the kitchen. Each footstep seemed to echo louder than the last, each one bringing me closer to whatever was waiting in the shadows. The kitchen was dark, save for the faint light that filtered in through the window. The air smelled faintly of the pizza I had been expecting, but the warmth that usually accompanied such a scent had dissipated. The temperature had dropped, and the chill in the air made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears as I scanned the room. The refrigerator was humming quietly, but everything else was still. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was just my nerves getting the best of me after the long day. I took another step into the room, reaching for the light switch, but as my hand brushed the wall, something caught my eye.
The door to the pantry was slightly ajar. I froze, my blood running cold. The pantry had been closed earlier. I was sure of it. I never left it open, but now it was barely cracked. A sliver of darkness peeking out from the gap. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I couldn't tell if I was moving or if the house itself was pushing me forward. My legs carried me to the pantry door before I could even think to stop them. I reached out with trembling fingers, my breath shallow, my thoughts racing. The door creaked as I pulled it open, revealing nothing but darkness. For a moment, I stood there, staring into the blackness, trying to convince myself that there was nothing to be afraid of, that it was just my mind playing tricks. But then something shifted in the shadows. A movement, a faint, almost imperceptible shape, too quick for me to make out clearly. Ah. So, yeah, when I stepped back, my heart in my throat, and slammed the pantry door shut. The sound of the door hitting the frame seemed deafening in the quiet house. I leaned against the counter, trying to steady myself, but the weight of what I had just seen, or thought I saw, was unbearable. The panic began to rise in my chest, and I forced myself to breathe, to think logically. There was no one here. It had to be my imagination, a trick of the light. But the feeling lingered. That unsettling sensation that something was just out of sight, just beyond reach, waiting, watching. I glanced back toward the living room, the place that had once felt so familiar, so safe. It now felt foreign, as though it no longer belonged to me. The silence was deafening, and my thoughts were a chaotic swirl of fear and confusion. I needed to check the house, make sure I wasn't just overreacting. I grabbed the nearest flashlight from the drawer and slowly made my way through the rooms one by one. The living room, the bathroom, the bedroom. Every room was as it should be, but the unsettling feeling never left me. The air was thick, almost suffocating. When I reached the hallway again, I noticed something strange. The front door, now securely closed, had a faint smear of something dark across the floor. I knelt down, my heart pounding in my chest as I inspected it closer. It was a trail, a faint, sticky trail that led toward the kitchen. My mind raced with the implications, but I couldn't quite make sense of it. I stood up quickly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The house felt alive now, its walls closing in, its silence growing more oppressive. The scraping sound had returned, louder this time, and it seemed to come from somewhere behind me. So I spun around, flashlight in hand, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the growing feeling that I was not alone. The air in the house felt colder now, a biting chill that sank into my bones. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't see, but could almost feel, hovering just beyond the edge of my vision. The scraping sound had stopped, but the tension remained, thick and suffocating. I stood frozen in the hallway, my eyes darting between the rooms. The flashlight in my hand trembled as I scanned the space around me, but there was nothing. Nothing but the same dark corners, the same stillness. Yet something was off. The silence felt too perfect, too unnatural. I forced myself to take a step forward toward the kitchen. The trail of dark smears still lingered in my mind, an unsettling image I couldn't ignore. It had to be from something, someone who had entered while I wasn't looking. But that didn't explain the strange sounds, the feeling of being watched. I didn't know what to believe anymore. I moved cautiously, trying to keep my breathing steady. The kitchen, once so familiar, now felt foreign. The air was colder here, too, the usual warmth of the oven and stove absent. I glanced around the room, my eyes lingering on the pantry door, still closed tightly. The faint smear of something dark on the floor, now more visible in the flashlight's beam, caught my attention again. I knelt down to get a better look, my heart pounding in my chest.
It wasn't just a smear, it was a trail, thin, almost deliberate, leading from the pantry to the center of the kitchen. It looked like some sort of sticky substance, but it wasn't anything I recognized. My mind raced, trying to place what it could be, but nothing fit. Suddenly, the silence broke with a soft thud. the sound coming from the far corner of the room. I whipped around, flashlight trembling in my hand. There, standing in the corner, was something I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was a shape, dark and indistinct, like a shadow that had somehow taken form. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline jagged and shifting, as though it was made of the very darkness in the room. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence. Cold, malevolent, watching. I froze, unable to move, unable to look away. My breath caught in my throat, the fear crawling up my spine, tightening around my chest. The shape didn't move, but I could feel it drawing closer, inch by inch, like it was closing the distance between us. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. My body felt like it was made of stone, paralyzed with terror. The flashlight flickered, its beam growing dimmer with each passing second, until it finally sputtered out, plunging me into darkness. The air was thick with something heavy, suffocating. I could still feel it there, standing just a few feet away, though I couldn't see it anymore. The silence stretched on, broken only by the rapid beat of my heart. She kept walking, but some of the need for exercise within me at home was eradicated. I hoped anyone who tried had had clothing big enough to take. I reached for the flashlight, fumbling in the dark. My hands were slick with sweat, my fingers numb with fear, but I finally managed to grab it and twist it back on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but the shape was gone. The corner of the room was empty. I let out a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe it had just been my mind playing tricks on me. The stress, the fear, the overwhelming silence, it was all getting to me. I turned around, moving quickly toward the living room, hoping that leaving the kitchen would somehow calm my nerves. But as I reached the doorway, something caught my eye. The front door, still locked, still shut, was now wide open. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard it open, hadn't seen anyone pass through. The house was silent, still, and yet the door was wide open, as if inviting me into whatever waited outside. I approached it cautiously, my pulse racing, my body tense. The air outside was cold, biting, and the darkness beyond the doors seemed to stretch on endlessly. No one was there. No footsteps. No sign of anyone passing through. Just the empty night. I glanced back into the house, the shadows in the living room stretching long and dark like they were reaching out for me. The room felt wrong, off, as if something was lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I knew I had to close the door, but something held me there, frozen in place. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out, to run. But where would I go? The house felt like a trap, a place that was no longer mine. I could feel the weight of something heavy, something ancient, pressing down on me, filling the space with a suffocating presence. I took a step toward the door, and then another, each movement slow and deliberate, like I was being pulled toward it by some unseen force. My hand reached out for the door, and as I touched the cold metal handle, the scrape of something against the floor broke the silence once again. It was coming from the pantry. The round, my heart pounding, my mind racing, the shape from earlier. Was it there? Had it followed me? I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see. But my feet were already moving toward it, my body acting without my permission, as if I had no choice but to face whatever waited. He turned to the red flesh, and as I reached the pantry door, I heard it again. That scraping sound, but this time it was louder. It was closer. Something was inside. The scraping noise was unmistakable now, sharp and rhythmic, like nails dragging across wood. It came from within the pantry, just beyond the door, and my heart raced in time with the sound. I should have run, should have left the house the moment I'd felt the presence of something sinister. But instead, my feet were rooted to the spot, as if some invisible force was holding me in place. The flashlight in my hand trembled, casting erratic beams of light that flickered as I stepped toward the pantry door. Each footfall echoed too loudly in the silence, the house seeming to grow quieter with every movement I made. I reached the door, my fingers brushing against the cold, worn wood. The scraping had stopped, leaving only an oppressive silence behind. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door, listening. My breath was shallow, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What was in there? What had made that sound? My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to flee, but curiosity gnawed at me, and fear held me still. I grasped the door handle and twisted, slowly pulling it open. The hinges groaned in protest, the door creaking as it inched inward. The pantry beyond was pitch black, the light from my flashlight barely penetrating the thick shadows that clung to the corners. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on me, like it was alive, waiting. Then I saw it. At the far end of the pantry, something moved. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, crouched low to the ground. Its body was unnaturally twisted, as if it had been bent in ways no human body should bend. The figure was hunched, its limbs too long, its hands scraping against the floor in that same unnerving rhythm. "Linny!" My breath caught in my throat as the figure turned toward me. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was a grotesque blur of darkness and shifting shadows, an expression I couldn't quite comprehend. Its eyes, however, were clear. Too clear. Two dark, hollow pits locked onto mine with an intensity that froze me to the core. It didn't move, but the air around me seemed to vibrate with its presence, like it was drawing something from the very air. A cold, unnatural energy, like the chill of death itself, crept through the room. My heartbeat thundered in my chest, and I felt a deep, visceral terror that made my body tremble. I tried to speak, but my voice was lost, swallowed by the thick silence that had taken over the room. I could feel it. Whatever this thing was, it was feeding on my fear. It was aware of me, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. Without thinking, I slammed the pantry doors shut. The sudden sound echoed through the house, a deafening thud that sent a shock of panic through me. I stood there, trembling, my back pressed against the door, trying to catch my breath. My pulse raced, my mind spinning with 1,000 questions. What had I just seen? What was that thing? I stumbled back into the kitchen, my eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. The silence was oppressive, the air thick with tension. The house felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. Like it was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I turned to the front door. It was still wide open, the night air spilling in, carrying with it a faint, strange scent I couldn't place. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this house before whatever was lurking inside came for me. But as I took a step toward the door, a thought struck me. The trail of dark smear in the kitchen, the one that led from the pantry, hadn't been there when I first entered. I was sure of it. It had appeared after the scraping sound, after I had opened the pantry door. I turned back toward the kitchen, my heart pounding as I followed the trail with my eyes. It wasn't just a smear anymore. It had grown. The dark substance was now pooling in the center of the kitchen, a thick, viscous mass that seemed to pulse with an eerie life of its own. It spread out in a slow, deliberate pattern, like it was drawing something closer. I took a step back, my mind racing. What was happening? Was this part of the same thing that had been in the pantry? Was it all connected? I couldn't make sense of it, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't normal. This wasn't anything I could explain. I turned back to the door, desperate to escape. But as I reached for the handle, a soft whisper, barely audible, slid through the air. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was a sound, like a breath, like something was calling my name. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my body stiffening as I listened. The whisper came again, closer this time, like it was right behind me. "Come back," it breathed, the words heavy with malice. "You're not finished yet." My blood ran cold. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, still. Yet the feeling of being watched, of being followed, only grew stronger. I slammed the door shut behind me, but the whisper didn't stop. It lingered, a constant hum in the back of my mind. The shadows in the room seemed to move, shifting and swirling like they had a life of their own. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this house another minute. I had to leave. I thought about my family. But as I turned to make my way toward the exit, the front door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. And then the lights went out. The sudden plunge into darkness felt like a physical blow. My heart raced, and my breath became shallow as I fumbled for the flashlight in my pocket. I found it after a moment, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. The weak beam of light flickered to life, casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. The house was unnervingly silent. No whispers, no scraping sounds, just the oppressive quiet that made my skin crawl. The light from the flashlight barely cut through the dense darkness, the shadows stretching out like dark tendrils, clawing at the edges of my vision. I was disoriented, panic creeping in as I realized I had no idea what was happening. My mind was clouded with fear, unable to make sense of the events that had unfolded. I needed to get out. I needed to leave this house before whatever was lurking here could get to me. I moved cautiously toward the front door, my steps slow and deliberate, but the feeling of something behind me, something watching me, was undeniable. I could feel it in the air, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. "Don't look," I snapped, holding him there. When I reached the door, I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I twisted and pulled, but the door remained firmly shut. Panic surged through me, my mind racing with 100 frantic thoughts. The door had been open just moments ago. How could it be locked now? I stepped back, breathing heavily, trying to think. There had to be another way out, maybe a window, or another door. But as I turned toward the kitchen, my heart skipped a beat. The smear, the dark substance, was spreading faster now, creeping across the floor in a slow, deliberate crawl. It had moved from the center of the kitchen to the hallway, and now it was reaching toward the living room. The thick, black ooze shimmered under the flashlight's weak beam, pulsating like it was alive. A chill ran through me as I realized the truth. It wasn't just the pantry that had been affected. The entire house was changing, warping into something unnatural, something that wasn't part of the world I knew. The dead woman scowled as she watched my naked body come apart. I took a step back, my body shaking. I had to get out. I had to escape this nightmare. As I turned away from the kitchen, the faintest sound reached my ears. It was soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but it quickly grew louder, clearer, like footsteps, deliberate and slow. Someone, or something, was moving through the house. I turned toward the source of the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I couldn't see anything, but the noise was unmistakable. It was getting closer, moving down the hallway toward me. I froze, my blood running cold. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey, paralyzed by fear. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then from the corner of my eye. I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, stood in the hallway. It was just a silhouette at first, a shadow among shadows. But as the light from my flashlight caught it, I could make out the shape more clearly. The figure was impossibly thin, its limbs too long, too unnatural. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, and its eyes, those dark, hollow pits, glowed faintly in the dim light. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there, watching me. But then it took a step forward, and then another. I backed away, my breath coming in quick gasps, but the figure didn't stop. It was coming closer, its long, bony arms reaching out toward me, its mouth stretching open in a grotesque grin. "Come back," it whispered, its voice a raspy, distorted hiss. "You're not finished yet." I stumbled backward, my mind reeling with terror. The figure's presence was suffocating, its eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I needed to escape. But before I could move, the figure lunged forward, its arms extending impossibly long, grabbing me by the wrist with a grip that felt like ice. A sharp, agonizing cold shot through me as I struggled to pull away, but its grip was unyielding. The pain was unbearable, like my very soul was being drained away. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the thick, suffocating darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The grip on my wrist disappeared, and I fell to the ground, gasping for air. My body was trembling uncontrollably, my heart racing as I scrambled to my feet. I had to get out. I had to escape before it came back. I turned toward the front door again, but it was still locked. The house felt alive now, the walls closing in on me, the shadows creeping toward me like they were alive. There was no way out, no escape. I ran. My feet pounded against the floor as I sprinted down the hallway toward the back of the house. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from whatever was chasing me. The hallway stretched on endlessly, the walls narrowing as I ran. The darkness seemed to swallow me whole, the air thick and suffocating. I could feel the presence of something behind me, getting closer with each step. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, a door, one I hadn't noticed before, stood ajar. A sliver of light spilled out from the crack, the only light in the house. Without hesitation, I ran toward it, my pulse hammering in my chest. I reached the door, throwing it open with all my strength. But what I saw beyond the door was not what I expected. The room was empty. But the air was thick with the presence, something dark, something ancient. And standing in the center of the room was a figure, its back to me, its head tilted toward the ceiling. A mumble of conversation came from behind me, but my eyes embarrassed me, for the image on the screen was of some kind. The figure turned slowly, its hollow eyes locking onto mine, and then it spoke. "Welcome home." I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure before me, its thin, emaciated body draped in tattered shadows, had an air of familiarity to it. The way it tilted its head, the slow, deliberate movements, it felt like I had seen it before, in dreams, in nightmares, maybe even in some forgotten corner of my mind. But I couldn't remember when, where, or why. I only knew that it was the last thing I wanted to face right now. The figure's lips curled into a slow, mocking smile, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too jagged for a human mouth. It was smiling at me, but the smile didn't reach its eyes. Those eyes, they were endless, hollow, pools of darkness that seemed to draw everything into them. "Welcome home," it repeated, its voice like gravel scraping against stone, cold and distant. You've been running from me for so long." The words felt like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath from my lungs. Running? From it? What was it talking about? My mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of this nightmare, but they wouldn't come together. There was too much terror, too much confusion. "It's all I live," came the first voice, startling and distorted. I took a hesitant step forward, my feet feeling like lead, my body trembling from the cold sweat that drenched my skin. I had to understand. I had to know what was happening. The situation outside was not natural, especially for a small man who had never come close to death and had never suffered from victimhood syndrome or a brain injury. "What are you?" My voice came out barely above a whisper, hoarse from the fear that choked me. The figure tilted its head further, as if considering my question. Then it stepped forward, and the floor creaked under its weight. I flinched, instinctively taking a step back, but the figure's gaze never left me. "You've always known," it said, its voice softer now, almost tender. "You just didn't want to remember." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that clouded my mind. Remember what? The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. I could feel the temperature in the room drop even further, the cold seeping into my bones. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. My legs were like stone, my heart thudding in my chest like a drumbeat of doom. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out again, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it stepped closer, so close now that I could see the strange patterns that seemed to shift and move across its skin. It was like a patchwork of shadows and whispers, like it was made of the very darkness itself. "You've forgotten," it said softly, almost sorrowfully. "You've forgotten the truth, but you can't run from it forever." I felt a cold wave wash over me, as if the figure's words were sinking into my skin, into my very soul. Forgotten? What truth? What was it talking about? Suddenly, a flood of memories hit me, rushing to the surface like a torrent. Flashes of faces, places, moments, all jumbled together, distorted and twisted. There were voices, too, whispers in the dark, calling my name, urging me to remember. And then it all came crashing down. I remembered. The house. The place I had tried to leave behind. The reason I had come back. It was all connected. This nightmare, this figure. It was part of something much bigger, something I had buried deep within myself. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as the realization hit me with full force. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a prison, and I had been its prisoner. The figure wasn't a stranger, it was something I had created, something I had summoned in a desperate attempt to escape. The figure's smile widened as it watched me crumble under the weight of the truth. "You were always meant to return," it whispered, its voice laced with dark amusement. "This place, this curse, it's yours. You can't run from it, not anymore." The words felt like a death sentence, like the last of my hope was being torn away. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but all I could do was stand there, trapped in the suffocating grip of my own mind. "You?" The figure reached out, its long fingers brushing my cheek with an unnatural gentleness. "Because you are mine," it said softly, the words sending a chill through me. "And you always will be." However, I felt a surge of panic, a desperate need to escape. But there was no way out. The house was closing in on me, the walls pressing tighter, the shadows crawling along the floor, the ceiling, the corners. There was nowhere left to run. The figure's grip tightened on my arm, pulling me toward it, and the room seemed to twist, warping and distorting as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the terror, but it was no use. The figure's voice echoed in my mind, growing louder, filling every corner of my thoughts. "You'll never be free of me," it whispered. "Not now, not ever." I felt myself being pulled deeper into the darkness, the room around me fading, becoming an endless void. The last thing I heard before everything went black was its voice, soft and mocking, repeating those same words. "Welcome home," he said with a... The next time I opened my eyes, I was standing outside. The house, the figure, the terror, they were all gone, as if they had never existed. The sun was rising, casting a soft, golden light over the landscape, but something was wrong. I looked down at my hands, and there, on my wrist, was a mark, a symbol that I didn't recognize, but one that seemed to burn into my skin. It was the same mark I had seen on the figure's body. It wasn't free, not really, and I knew deep down that I would never escape the house, because the house was inside me, and it always would be. The end.